Okay. Okay, well, I want to thank both Ted and Andrea for inviting me to address the local chapter here. I find it very exciting to do so, and as well as anyone else that might be listening in this afternoon. Now, the resiliency challenges I'll discuss derive specifically from certain criteria recommended via site analysis performed for both the shipyard property and also the FIS headquarters property or building headquarters presently under construction. The shipyard study recommendations were more global in nature, and that is to say there was no specific structures proposed at the time. So it was basically a site analysis. But in my opinion, the results of that study, which we can provide to anyone, can be extrapolated to both the north and the south bank of the city waterfront by all parties or any parties. Conversely, the FIS resiliency recommendations were very project specific, i.e. to the building under construction, and are there codified, ultimately became codified into the present day building design. At the end of my discussion, I'll detail the resiliency guidelines for the FIS project, as well as the rationale for their considerations and their ultimate adoption by the design team. I apologize a little bit for the size of the letters in this PowerPoint. They derive specifically from PowerPoints whereby they're presented in rooms where if you sat 30 rows back, you could read it. Because I always hate to not be able to read when I go to a conference what's on the screen. So you'll see that the presentation is a little bit bold at least with respect to its structure. Now, my comments are going to focus primarily on downtown, both North and South Banks, and the historical neighborhoods of San Marco, Ortega, and Riverside, Avondale. And so it'd be basically everything southward of the Matthews Bridge, let's say down to the Buckman Bridge. These are the areas which were most severely impacted by Hurricane Irma in 2017. You've probably seen a number of slides of the storm event. This is the intersection of Stockton Street and Riverside about a day or two afterwards. But more specifically, if you were viewing the storm from the Villa Riva condominium, you would have seen something like this, whereby during the course of the event, the seawall, the roadways, and the streets adjacent to the River Road there were severely inundated during the event. Again, you've probably seen these. This is San Marco and downtown after the event. This is water that is stranded within the streetways due to the height of the river after the storm. Now, there's basically three primary issues of consequence that I want to discuss. Flood vulnerability having to do with low frequency events. Low frequency events would be defined as tropical storms, hurricanes, and perhaps even some extratropical events. And the other is nuisance flooding. And there'll be two types of nuisance flooding that I'll get into. These are high frequency events, and they're due principally to astronomical tides only. I'm also going to discuss the effects of sea level rise.
Make that work.
Oops.
I plugged it in.
Is there a mouse? Does mouse work?
I need to mute everybody, I guess. I got muted myself, sorry. Backgrounds and definition. Unless you moved to Jacksonville last week, everyone probably knows that the St. Johns River, even though it floods northward from a very large flood basin, drainage basin, it is significantly tidal, and particularly downtown. So if we look at the characteristics of those tides, let's say just at the Acosta Bridge, just to give you an idea of the range of the tide, particularly through the months of the year, you've got average tides of about 2 feet. You have spring tides, as indicated here, During new moons, we have the highest tides of the year, which are called king tides, which is not a technical term, but nonetheless, it generally reflects the perigean tides of the year, which are the highest that we experience in the river. You have a varying mean tide level, and I'll get into this in a little more detail. Yeah. So king tide, if you've heard this recently in the literature or in news accounts, more likely, it's a colloquial term. It's not a technical term. It's not a scientific term, but it is being used more and more in general vernacular. It basically has to do with the highest of the high tides of the year. Now, we're very fortunate in that we have downtown a tide gauge which has been in existence for several decades. The benefit of that is that we now have tide records that reflect the downtown city core, which is different than the tides, let's say, at the mouth of the St. Johns River, okay? And I'll demarcate the benefits or the attributes of that in just a second. Also shown on this particular slide, however, is something that's called, that's mapped as a CHHA, the Coastal High Hazard Area. This is a relatively recent mapping that was the result of the adaptation action area working group from about a year or two ago, which was charged with defining the areas within the city most likely impacted by a 2-foot sea level rise to occur by 2060. And this is actually a statutory charge that derived from a House bill or legislation in 2015. And I'll get into the significance of that in a few minutes. Now, I mentioned that there's a lot of data associated with the South Bank Riverwalk tide gauge. The only information really that you'll want to use for purposes of design downtown, for all intents and purposes, is the elevation of the mean high water line. And that's the significance of that is that defines where the landowner generally owns to. Now, it's kind of a non sequitur downtown because for throughout most of the downtown, which is seawalled or bulkheaded, the mean high water line lies on the face of the structure. More significantly, if you look at the specific data for the South Bank Riverwalk tide gauge, you see something like this. This is the predicted tides throughout the year, this current year, okay? Several points of significance here, particularly if you're trying to design something, either a building or more specifically, drainage structures downtown, either for new development or redevelopment. Notice that during the hurricane season, beginning actually this month, extending through November, we have the highest astronomical tides of the year, okay? Significantly higher than the average mean high water, which means that that is an irrelevant datum with respect to, let's say, designing a drainage structure around. Also significant for this is that the highest astronomical tides, and these are still water tides, also occur during the season when we have nor'easters, which typically is around the earliest part of the month of October. So again, the highest points that are the highest tides that we exhibit and that we have to live with and design around occur in this time of the year. And this is not an anomalous shape just for 2021. This is a characteristic of downtown tidal conditions associated with this gauge that don't vary very much from year to year. So again, we know that the downtown riverfront is highly tidal. The range can increase. Matter of fact, if we have nor'easters, those ranges can increase by a foot and a half very easily. The long-term influences on the tidal conditions that we are exhibited downtown today all revolve around river channelization since the 1800s. If you saw the newspaper article about a week or week and a half ago by Nate Monroe having to do with river channelization, I'm sorry to say, but it's all spot on. It is highly accurate. That is to say that through the construction of the jetties at the mouth of the St. Johns River in the 1800s and the continuing deepening and extension of a navigation channel for purposes of commercial port activities, we basically invited the river downtown. And so the level of tidal influence that we have now, the level of vulnerability to storm surge and other phenomena originating in the ocean and the river between downtown and, let's say, the mouth of the river, all have to do with the channelization of the river and its improvements, quote unquote, improvements over time. I'm sure it's intuitively obvious, but again, if you're designing particularly drainage structures downtown, the St. Johns River is the receiving body. So whatever happens in the St. Johns River dictates your ability to implement drainage schemes for new development or for redevelopment. Also, throughout time, through the last 100 years, we know that we have had sea level rise in the St. Johns River and at the mouth of the St. Johns River. It's historically been about a foot per century. That's the cocktail knowledge, or the cocktail number. This is all derived from a long-term gauge, which was initiated in about 1929 and records today at the mouth of the river. Okay, this particular gauge is located just inside the mouth of the river at the pilot station. And so what it says is that the long-term average over the last 90 years has been about 9/10 of a foot. So the rough number that we use, or the cocktail number as we sometimes refer to it, is about a foot per century. And historically, or through at least the last couple decades, this has been coincident with most of the long-term tide gauges located along the eastern seaboard of the United States. You've probably seen and certainly heard and read articles that sea level is rising worldwide. What you may not realize is that it's not rising at the same rate throughout the world. Obviously, we're located here in a more moderate area of sea level rise, which again, according to the Mayport gauge, on average over 90 years is about 2.62 millimeters per year. You can see that globally there's some very large hotspots. I can't explain why. A lot of this probably has to do with tectonic activity. Now, that's the foot per century is the good news, because that's a relatively modest rate. We've been able to live with it for the last 100 or 150 years that Jacksonville has been developed. However, recently we've been asked by a number of counties and cities, which are clients, to evaluate the more recent rises in sea level that are causing problem flooding, particularly nuisance flooding, which I'll get into in a few minutes. So we've looked at Brevard County, we've looked at Broward County, Palm Beach County, and so we thought, for purposes of the analysis that we've been doing lately, particularly for the shipyards property, which was the last analysis that we did, we would look at the more recent time frames of the data that I showed you a little bit earlier from the Mayport gauge. So let's say if you look at the last 20 years of record, you find that you get a sea level rate of rise of about 2 foot per century, not the 8.72 feet over the 90 years. So that's 2.3 times higher than the average. If you look at the last 15 years, you get something that's about 3 times higher. And if you look at the last 10 years, relative to the long-term record, you get something that's much more dramatic. It's about 3.74 feet per century. Now, we'd be the first to acknowledge that these are very short periods of record, and so you can't necessarily hang your hat statistically on that type of information. Also, we would note that there are interannual variations in mean sea level that can be detected in that Mayport gauge data that are almost on decadal cycles. So you have to be very careful about the cycle that you pick. Now, in those particular cases, we just picked the obvious 10-year cycles beginning in 2020. But again, the data is short-term, and we really won't know whether or not we're in a decadal cycle for another 5 years or so. But again, what the data shows is that, as the climatologists have predicted, there is something going on, and we do have an increase in the rate of sea level rise along the East Coast and certainly propagated up the St. Johns River to the city of Jacksonville. Now I'm going to talk for a minute about nuisance flooding, and by definition, this is flooding that causes public inconveniences, such as frequent road closures, and more importantly, or as importantly, overwhelmed storm drains, which again can cause frequent road closures, as well as compromised infrastructure. Probably the poster child worldwide for nuisance flooding is Venice, Italy. Venice has a very long-term record, which goes back to the 1800s, as you can see here. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that part of the rise in water level at this location, it's not all sea level. Venice is also a landform that is artificial in nature, and so it's also subsiding. So, but the cumulative effect of that is that the water level adjacent to Venice is increasing over time at a pretty high rate. So Venice has noticed over time and has recorded the number of flood events which have occurred, and it's never increasing phenomena as shown here. Interestingly enough, the International Coastal Engineering Conference, which is held biannually around the world, was in Venice in 1992. And basically the conditions look something like this. This is nuisance flooding at its extreme. But I will say that the attendees of this conference basically experienced the exact same phenomena. So the word to the rise is that if you're going to visit Venice anywhere in the near future, don't bring your best shoes, and do bring boots if you have them available. But it's not this problem of nuisance flooding isn't isolated to just Venice. Again, you've probably read and seen in the news accounts that it is routinely affecting Miami Beach and some of the other southeast communities. These are pictures of Fort Lauderdale, or this is a picture of Fort Lauderdale. And again, these two pictures of Miami Beach, and this is just 2015, so this is 6 years ago, and it certainly hasn't gotten any better over time. This is Annapolis, Maryland. So again, this is nuisance flooding. These are astronomical tides, okay? This is not a hurricane. This is not a tropical storm. These are very high astronomical tides. So there's two types basically of nuisance flooding due to increases in water level. One is where you get overbank flooding during periods of astronomical tides, where the water literally goes over the bulkhead, goes over the bank, goes over whatever the structural stabilization is along the water's edge. The other phenomena directly associated with this is compromised upland drainage caused by upland flooding during rainfall events. And the reason that occurs is generally because the water cannot be relieved to the drainage basin, which is the St. Johns River, because the river is super elevated. Now here in Jacksonville, if you're familiar with San Marco, if you live there, or you may have driven through it during periods of nuisance flooding, it is beginning to become severely compromised with respect to drainage. And I would suggest when you start to look at multiple feet of sea level rise over time, you're going to find that downtown is going to become more prone to nuisance flooding, particularly where walls and elevations are not significantly high. I'll also tell you that there's going to be additional sea level rise and nuisance flooding due just to the channel deepening, which is underway at this particular point in time. Now, the reason that, let's say, San Marco has, from a hydraulic perspective, why it has nuisance flooding, if you go back and you look at the drainage systems which were implemented, let's say 50, 60, 70 years ago, or maybe even more, St. Johns River was at a lower elevation, okay? And by virtue of that, we had a head difference, which was sufficient to allow for the water to be caught in drop basins and distributed or transported to the river during, by dendritic type culvert systems. But now that we have super elevated water elevations, both on an annual basis, and then we can have extraordinary high tides, nor'easters, etc., we have much less of a head difference. And so we have an encumbered drainage system, whereby the water cannot relieve itself quick enough. And so we begin to experience roadway flooding, such as that you saw a little bit earlier in San Marco, on San Marco Boulevard, on Hendricks Avenue, in a variety of locations throughout those historic neighborhoods. I will note that at this point in time, I believe that the city has implemented about 4 or 5 pumping stations to begin to alleviate this type of a drainage impedance. And I would suggest to you that's going to become the norm rather than the exception over time. Now, I mentioned that the channel deepening is going to increase problems with nuisance flooding. And that is because the Corps of Engineers' own modeling numbers show that in the downtown area and historic neighborhoods, when the project is completed to minus 47 feet, we will get an increase of about 0.2 of a foot in the tidal range. Now, that doesn't appear to be a lot, and it didn't appear to be a lot in the Corps studies. Matter of fact, when this was brought to the Corps' attention, their comments relative to this minor increase in water level was that, well, if you're going to experience 2 to 3 or 4 feet of sea level rise over the next century, it's basically inconsequential. But it's not inconsequential to areas that have nuisance flooding today, and particularly San Marco. So again, if you go back and you look at the last 50 years and you begin to look at today's conditions, and you begin to realize that, let's say, on the low head difference that I have today is going to be diminished by another 1/10 or 0.2 of a foot. That is significant with respect to a drainage system where you have culverts that are multiples of thousands of feet long. And so again, I would suggest that when that project is completed, we will have additional nuisance flooding. And I would also note that you don't have to wait to 2060 to realize this nuisance flooding. This exacerbation of nuisance flooding will occur as soon as the dredging is done. So that would be in the near-term horizon. Well, how can we begin to predict the impacts of nuisance flooding? Well, again, I mentioned that we're very lucky to have the South Bank tide gauge, which has a significantly reasonable long period of record that allows us to develop a probabilistic curve of high waters that occur annually, okay? So once we have done that, we can begin to develop a series of nomographs that look at increases in the water level over time based through sea level rise. And this is basically what we're talking about here, just pure sea level rise. And we can develop nomographs. And we have developed these nomographs, and we'll be glad to share them with any other design professionals. We've developed nomographs for our seawall elevations, cap elevations, bulkhead cap elevations, anywhere between about 2.5 feet and about 7 feet. So this is one case example. This is one nomograph where the absolute elevation of your bulkhead is at +4 feet and AVD 88. Now, what this says is that if the adaptation area, action area predictions or studies are correct, or at least come to fruition, and by 2060 we have a 2-foot rise in sea level, we will have an occasion whereby we have at least 33 occasions per year where the astronomical tides exceed the cap elevation of that wall, okay? So that's what this is all about. So let's say we look at, maybe we have 1.5 feet, or we have a 1-foot rise in sea level. If that's the case, then really we won't see an astronomical tide exceeding the cap elevation. 1.5 foot rise in sea level, such as the purple line here, we will have, let's see, from maybe 5 occasions per year whereby the astronomical tides exceed the cap elevation. Now, again, remember that the astronomical tides are the still water tides. They don't include nor'easters. They don't include effects of hurricanes, tropical storms, thunderstorms, blows, boat wake, ship wake, wind waves, okay? This is still water conditions. So let's look at a case example, a real life case example. If we go to the St. Vincent's Hospital and we measure the elevation of the cap seaward of St. Vincent's, we find that it's actually at plus 3 feet NAVD 88. Now that's a fairly low cap elevation. So what this data shows, the problem, and this is the probabilistic curve. However, if we take this section of the curve, and again, we put it in a nomograph where it's more usable, we find that with just 1 foot rise in sea level, that particular cap elevation will be exceeded 35 times per year, okay? With half a rise in sea level, it'll be exceeded about 10 times per year. With a 1.5 foot rise in sea level, let's say 2 feet rise in sea level, you're talking about the cap being exceeded almost every day of the year, okay? So that's the significance of sea level rise relative to the stabilization and the shoreline that we have today. And there are a number of shorelines, in my opinion, which are accidents waiting to happen. So again, you have 2 types of nuisance flooding. One, as I just showed you, let's say with a 2 foot rise in sea level, we literally will have situations where the astronomical tides alone will exceed the cap elevations, and inundation of the upland, depending on the elevations, will occur. And again, if you have specific areas where the cap elevations are relatively more, or they're more robust, let's say at about plus or 5 or 6 feet NAVD, you may still have conditions whereby the super elevated water levels, in combination with boat wake, wind waves, exceed to some degree the cap elevation of that particular section of shoreline. And that becomes important, particularly when you're looking at river walks. So again, going back to the adaptation area working group, which I was a part of about 2 years ago, the purpose of that group, again, was to develop this area in theory, which was susceptible to 2 feet of sea level rise by 2060. And again, that was a statutory requirement. That allowed the city of Jacksonville to then begin to recommend policies and guidelines to modify the coastal management element, and to begin to look at regulations necessary to ensure development and redevelopment is resilient. So it was a flag of areas which are vulnerable. Let's look more specifically at the downtown flood insurance maps. And this is going to become a focal point of my discussion. What you find, and this is an excerpt from the 2018 maps, which were just adopted in 2018, more or less, or a little bit afterwards, by the city of Jacksonville. This is the most updated FEMA elevation criteria for purposes of flood insurance, and in theory, for purposes of design. And if you're, as most of you know, the city of Jacksonville defers to these maps with respect to design criteria, whether it's relevant or irrelevant. It is certainly the minimum criteria. What you find is that for the city core downtown and for the historical neighborhoods of Ortega, Avondale, Riverside, San Marco, the 100-year predicted probabilistic storm surge elevation is only plus 4 feet NAVD, okay? That is relatively low. That is not very high. So in theory, only the areas demarcated here in blue are vulnerable to the 100-year storm. Now, what I just showed you earlier is that basically all of this area demarcated in orange and blue was demarcated as the area susceptible to 2 foot sea level rise. So basically all these maps show the 100-year surge elevation of plus 4 feet. I'm going to tell you that in my professional opinion, these firms are low by about 3 feet, possibly even more, and I'll tell you why. we measured still water elevations, or someone measured still water elevations within the St. Vincent's parking garage of +7 feet NAVD 88 with Hurricane Irma during that was the maximum water level in that area. I observed personally at the Villa Riva condominium very similar elevations, since they're only 2 doors or half a block down. Now, the significance of this is that Hurricane Irma wasn't even a hurricane when it approached Jacksonville. It was a tropical storm. Its maximum wind field was about 60 to 65 knots measured in NAS when those winds blew up the river, okay? So FEMA's telling you that statistically, the 100-year event is +4 feet, when with a storm which was only a tropical storm, we experienced elevations of about 7 feet. Downtown on the Shipyards property, the elevation, measured water elevation at that location and at the South Bank tide gauge was about 5.62 feet. So again, several feet higher than the 100-year storm predicted by FEMA. Now, I've heard people say, well, that was a very weird event. That was a very extraordinary event. And we don't get wind fields like that. We don't get storms that enter the state and come up to the west of Jacksonville with a wind field that blows directly up the river. Well, I'd say that's not true, and I'll show you why here in a second. So what we experienced obviously is significant out-of-bank flooding. We experienced flooding that was akin to Hurricane Dora in 1964, which was the maximum storm of record that had ever been experienced in the city of Jacksonville. And interestingly enough, if you have Dora in 64 and you have Irma in 17, and you have about 60 years between them, that's more likely the 50-year to the 60-year event. So again, type of overbank flooding. The flood insurance maps show that this wouldn't happen except with a 100-year probabilistic event. So we have this dichotomy of with respect to what we have experienced now in the very recent past. And so the rhetorical question is, why wasn't this predicted by FEMA? And as I mentioned, just a little bit ahead of myself, many people would say, because this was an extraordinary storm and it had an extraordinary track. Well, that's nonsense. This is the tracks of record of tropical storms and depressions for the state of Florida. And so I would submit to you that in all probability, it wasn't the most odd event, okay, with respect to a track. The reason why that it's not predicted in the FEMA mapping derives from the protocol that FEMA uses for purposes of flood insurance mapping in coastal communities, including Duval County. In its simplest sense, what the flood insurance studies do, and this is standard protocol, is they statistically determine through Monte Carlo modeling of all the characteristics associated with the storms of influence for Duval County and the areas, counties and sections of the state adjacent to us. They developed through Monte Carlo modeling the 100-year surge, once in a 100-year surge event for the mouth of the St. Johns River. They then propagate that elevation, those elevations, down the river through hydrodynamic models. So all the way down through the city, through Mill Cove, through Blunt Island, down to the city core and into the historical neighborhoods. Well, what they're doing is they never did, and they do not, and they should, analyze the phenomena that was associated with Hurricane Irma. So all of the mapping that you have, all of the elevations you have, the design criteria you have within the city core and the historical neighborhoods, which derive from the flood insurance maps, are relatively low, they're relatively conservative, and they're probably off by at least 3 feet. Matter of fact, in my opinion, someone, the city of Jacksonville or some entity, needs to go back and to reevaluate the statistical probability of the type of events associated with Hurricane Irma and statistically add that information into the storm surge information associated with the type of methodology used by FEMA to get a combined statistical meaningful maps for the city core of Jacksonville. And again, my comments only relate to the city core and to the historical neighborhoods. I'm not commenting on the storm surges associated with the beaches or with the areas of Blunt Island and some of the other areas down through Mill Cove. Those may be relatively accurate with respect to what they're intended to represent. But when it comes to the 1 in 100-year probabilistic event for the downtown city core in the historical neighborhoods, the FEMA maps are not correct. Well, let's look at, let's say, the significance of this just from another perspective, and particularly from the perspective of what will happen or what would happen if we have a sea level rise of 2 feet. Well, if we look at 100-year storm elevation, now this is an NGVD data, and it's older data from 1977. At that time, it was predicted that the downtown 100-year event would be about 6.2 feet. Well, if you have 2 foot of sea level rise, your 10-year statistically predicted event becomes equivalent to your 100-year event. Okay, this is another way of evaluating, at least particularly for the layman, just what the significance of 2 foot of sea level rise is relative to probabilistic storm impacts into the future. So the 10-year surge elevation with sea level rise becomes equivalent to the 100-year event. So the probability, another way of addressing this is the probability of occurrence of the 100-year water elevation today is increased by 10 times into the future if we have 2 feet of sea level rise downtown. So before I get into the case example at the end, I'll give you some key conclusions or takeaways. Now, these are relative to the conversation having to do with a 2 foot sea level rise. And again, the reason that's emphasized is because that's what the city of Jacksonville most recently evaluated through the Adaptation Action Area workshop, and which was basically authorized or required by statute. So the city core waterfront is going to become more susceptible, if it's not already in certain areas, to high frequency nuisance flooding. Certainly in areas where we have nuisance flooding today, the level of nuisance flooding is going to be astronomical with a 2 foot level of sea level rise. The future 100-year probabilistic storm surge is going to be equivalent to today's 10-year. Harbor deepening is going to increase the predicted 2 foot sea level rise by 10%. That's the 0.2 feet that I was talking about. Now, again, as I mentioned, that's going to occur not in 2060, okay, but it's going to occur at the end of the dredging contract. And at that point in time, you're going to find, by virtue of my predictions, increased or exacerbated nuisance flooding in some of the historical neighborhoods, and particularly in San Marco. Of consequence to anyone that develops or owns waterfront property today, pursuant to the current flood insurance mapping, you're going to find that by 2060, if you have 2 foot of sea level rise, you're going to be at significant risk for frequent flood damage and significantly or consequential higher insurance premium rates because you're going to be significantly out of compliance. And the flood insurance rate structure is punitive. For example, if you're in a V zone, you pay much more than if you're in an A zone. But what waterfront properties today, let's say if you're on Montgomery Boulevard, and if you're mapped in an A zone and sometime in the future you have a 2 foot level of sea level rise, you're going to be mapped or considered to be in a V zone. And your flood insurance rates are going to be astronomically higher. FEMA is already looking at ways to ad hoc consider sea level rise into their firms because it takes many years to go back and to redo flood insurance maps. So they're going to come up with a number of methodologies whereby it can be implemented on a short-term basis. One of the things they're looking at is a risk analysis of structures located in the 100-year and the 500-year floodplains, and the potential adjustment of flood premiums based on that risk. Something that I think is extremely important with respect to new development and existing development in proximity, let's say, to the city core and the neighborhoods, is that gravity drainage systems may no longer be effective in proximity to the St. Johns River and its tributaries. That is to say that the water levels will not be high enough to depend upon drainage systems which are driven by gravity. We will become, in all probability, therefore, more dependent upon pumping systems, such as the several which have been implemented in San Marco. Conversely, a word to the wise is that water detention vaults located below grade, which are used relatively routinely, will become irrelevant for many waterfront locations. And I can show you examples, case examples, where they can become a liability, thereby increasing flooding within the area that they're intended to serve as a detention structure. Well, in conclusion, what I'd like to do is give you a case example. This is the FIS office building under construction on Riverside Avenue, which I'm sure that all the architects are familiar with, and go over the aspects of resiliency, which came out of a study performed by our firm for the study team. Now, the project is located here between the Acosta Bridge and, of course, the Fuller Warren Bridge. It extends from the waterfront up to Riverside Avenue. And again, the 100-year probabilistic event here is +4 feet NGVD, as predicted by FEMA. The 500-year event is something a little bit less than 6 feet. So the guidelines that were recommended to the study team, which was at the time had just completed schematic level design, and they were moving relatively rapidly into design development. And at that time, the rhetorical question was asked, had they had any kind of an analytical resiliency analysis? And since they didn't, they retained our firm as their consultant to derive or to evaluate their project and to provide guidelines which assist them in increasing the amount of resiliency associated with this building into the future. And I might add here that the components of the building and the premise of the building that they had intended to build through schematic level design was pretty prudent. For example, they had intended to be well out of the 1 in 500 year floodplain. And by virtue of that, they had set a first floor elevation of about +10 in order to do that. And also to be coincident with the elevations of Riverside Avenue. So again, they were not in the first floor elevation and of the basic structure was not highly vulnerable. However, there were a number of components that they needed to go back and to consider. So in the analysis of their site, our first recommendation is do not look at the FEMA's or the City of Jacksonville's criteria associated with the flood insurance maps, whereby the base flood elevation would be +4, the BFE would be 4 feet. Instead, consider a BFE of +7 feet. Plan for 3 feet of sea level rise. And on top of that, consider a storm event with those two elements in mind. Consider the waves and the wave run-up on the riverfront during that design event. And in addition to that, include a number of other protective measures wherever you can. So this is a rudimentary schematic. This is obviously an engineering drawing and not an architectural drawing. It was derived from our report, which characterizes the site. So initially, the first floor elevation was at +10. The face of the building had a glass wall that extended down to the first floor. Seaward of the first floor is a relatively significant terrace amenity. So if you look at FEMA's elevations, and the Riverwalk here is at about elevation 5.5 NAVD. Seaward of the Riverwalk, there is existing riprap for purposes of long-term stabilization that have been placed by other entities. So if we look at the characteristics of the site, we see that FEMA's elevation doesn't even exceed the Riverwalk. However, if you take FEMA's elevations and you add the maximum sustained depth limited wave on it, it probably does. It probably would be about a little less than 6 feet. And so it would be to the top of the Riverwalk. The recommended base flood elevation by our firm to the design team was for an elevation of 7 feet, which would intersect the landscaping of the building, which is northward of the Riverwalk. On top of that, in this particular case, we're looking at the scenario evaluating 2 foot of sea level rise. You would add 2 foot of water. So you would have a design storm surge with sea level rise at an absolute elevation of about +9 feet. Now that's still water, okay, SWL. On top of that, you would have waves created on the riverfront, and you could have a maximum wave crest elevation based on depth limited waves of a little over 11 feet, 11.45 feet. Now, the result of all that is that, of course, you would have erosion of your landscaping area, which could endanger your terrace. And you would also have wave run-up, which would cross your terrace and which would reach the building face. So in the final design criteria for the building that's under construction, the first floor elevation was raised without causing much consternation from 10 feet to plus 11 feet NAVD. And a protective wall, as I'll show you in a second, was recommended to be constructed seaward of the terrace. And the purpose of the wall was basically to act as a wave trip to reduce wave energy and wave runoff. Flood panels were recommended to be in the passageways or the river facing glass wall. And I think it became obvious to everyone that instead of running the glass wall down to the floor, a certain amount of additional insurance could be garnered through the incorporation of stub walls below the glass wall. And then also the site civil firm looked at additional site and drainage modifications. Well, as engineers, we recommended a wall. Now, not a seawall per se, but a wall that was intended to reduce wave energy and wave runup, which again would reach the building terrace and potentially reach the face of the building. As engineers, we thought, well, the prudent place to put a wall would be adjacent to the Riverwalk. That way it would segregate the public use from the private and commercial use. Well, the landscape consultants determined pretty early on that you couldn't do that without damaging the tree line and the vegetation they wanted to preserve. So the wall was located a little more landward. And again, the purpose of the wall under the design storm surge event, maximum event that could occur, was to reduce the amount of wave run-up that would get to the wall and to the terrace, and to reduce erosion behind the wall during the very extreme event for which the building is designed. And again, the first floor elevation here would be increased by an absolute amount of a foot. The location of that wall would look something like this. And again, this is pretty early conceptual drawings. That wall will extend out of the grade, the landscape grade, of varying amounts depending on the landscape fill behind it and the vegetation behind it. The fascia of that wall, where it is exposed, will be attractive. It'll have a textured face so that it's an attractive complement to the building itself. So in conclusion, if you didn't know it, this is the design team associated with the FIS project. The development manager is the Jacksonville office of the Hines Group. The architect is a Gensler out of Tampa, and the site civil is England, Timms, and Miller from here in Jacksonville. And so that concludes my comments, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that the group may have. Okay.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that presentation. I'm sure we have some questions. I know I do. Brandon, I see you raise your hand.
Okay, so I have more than one, but I'll try to keep it to just two. So first of all, in terms of the riverfront parks now, we keep hearing that, you know, keeping parkland is good for the resiliency. So I do want you to just kind of explain from a technical standpoint how that works. And then also just what are your recommendations? What should we be pushing for from the city in terms of infrastructure or just resiliency?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's intuitively obvious that the further the buildings can be built back from the waterfront, the easier it is to design the resiliency and to keep them, to keep those resiliency components more modest so that the buildings are more user-friendly, which I know is always from an architectural viewpoint, is always a point of sensitivity. As consultants, when we raise buildings and develop all the onerous characteristics associated with a design event, we cause a great deal of consternation, obviously, with the design guys and the landscape guys in trying to accommodate those particular aspects of the building. So I think there clearly is an element of resiliency. With the further back you can place your habitable structures. You can also incorporate landscape features between the waterfront and the actual buildings themselves or the infrastructure to mitigate, let's say, a lot of these phenomena, and particularly, let's say, nuisance flooding, and also limit the effects of the design storm, which is, you know, the most grievous event that your building is going to be designed around. With respect to the city, I think the city just, you know, the city is 5 or 6 years behind the curve. The legislation for the resiliency analysis was associated with a House bill that was passed in like 2015. And there are cities and counties that are 5 or 6 years ahead of us and are already looking at ways to modify the riverfront and are funding ways to modify the riverfront. You know, unfortunately, back in 2016, the city of Jacksonville was offered $1 million grant to evaluate resiliency in the downtown city core, and we turned it down. So I think the biggest challenge in the city of Jacksonville is acknowledging the need to develop resiliency. It's basically being slow walked, in my opinion, and there are probably pretty obvious reasons for that, having to do with development and the encouragement of development and redevelopment. But the fact of life is that you know, the big players know what resiliency design is all about. And going on investments, you know, funded a resiliency study through their site civil engineers, England, Timms, and Miller. They know what the phenomena are, but there are other people out there that don't understand this and need to understand it, particularly if you're going to redevelop the Berkman Plaza or you name it. The word needs to get out as to the facts of life with respect to various sea level rise scenarios. And it's not to say that you can't design around it, but you've got to acknowledge it and you've got to factor it into your plan of attack and your building per se. And I think the preservation of the riverfront downtown through the Parks Group is a step in the right direction with respect to incorporating resiliency components into our future downtown development. But I think the the biggest challenge is for the acknowledgement of what the city faces. So the St. Johns River is our biggest amenity, and it's our biggest enemy, depending on how you face it and how you take it into account. If that makes sense.
How about Jimmy? I see you have your hand raised.
Hey, how's it going, Eric? Jimmy
Hey,
Owen.
Jimmy.
Hey,
Good.
you know, it's interesting. Some of the policymakers have really, I think, they're looking at it simply on a parcel by parcel basis, saying, "Hey, we just need to look at how do we make this particular development more resilient, such as maybe FIS or any other development." But can you address the need for a more holistic approach? Because it does seem like water is obviously going to flow to the lowest areas. So if you just increase the elevation of one property, the adjacent properties are going to be adversely impacted. And it seems like that's not a sustainable approach.
No, it's certainly not a good synergistic approach. One thing I would say is that all of the criteria that we've put forward in the shipyards analysis is available to anyone, and it is relevant to both sides of the river, North Bank and South Bank, and it's relevant to all development and future redevelopment on both banks. So that data is available, and it can be easily shared and taken into account by anybody that wants to access it themselves. Any design professionals or planners or developers or owners or insurance companies. You are correct, and actually, you know, both the FIS analysis and the shipyards analysis, they weren't required by the city of Jacksonville. The city of Jacksonville's design standards are woefully inadequate. You know, it's based around FEMA mapping and maybe adding a foot or two to it. There is no acknowledgement of the type of criteria or the type of phenomena that I just addressed here by the city of Jacksonville. And, you know, they need to come to grips with it, and they need to, like you say, incorporate that into the big picture, particularly with respect to existing drainage in other areas. You know, what are you going to do about Hogan's Creek? What are you going to do about San Marco in the future? You know, we look at spending multi-million dollar or generating multi-million dollar expenditures with the gas tax. I don't see anybody talking about money for resiliency, not $1. And yet those are probably the biggest fiscal liabilities that the city has and will need to participate in the future, particularly if they want redevelopment downtown and to encourage people to live in that environment. So again, I think the biggest.
What specifically would should the gas tax include for resiliency?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, I just looked at it and said, well, you know, we're looking at a people mover, but you're looking at, you know, orders of magnitude. There, you know, the state of Florida, I think, is now looking at, I think, funding $100 million in this legislature to cities and counties for beginning to implement resiliency features. We don't even acknowledge resiliency features. We don't have our handle on what resiliency features we might want to build. And so, you know, again, we're literally 6 years late to the game compared to many other counties, Broward County, Miami, you know, Dade County, and some of the West Coast counties with respect to already knowing what the resiliency liabilities are and what their resiliency needs are. And so City of Jacksonville needs to hurry it up, but they can't hurry it up until they acknowledge it. In my opinion, they haven't acknowledged it.
There was a question in the chat. Will the wall at FIS feel like a knee wall, or how high up from the Riverwalk elevation will it be?
Good question. It will be 3 feet above it. It will be at an absolute elevation of 8.5 feet. Now, I'm told by the designers about a week or two ago that it may protrude out of the ground by as much as 3 feet, depending on where it's located in the landscape berm and what the final landscape plan looks like. So it's not a high wall. It'll look like a knee wall, basically. may even be covered, with landscaping vines. Who knows what the ultimate plan is, or covered up with shrubbery and vegetation. See water word of it, but it's not an innocuous large wall. That's a good question.
Another question from the chat is there a preference for seawall and bulkhead versus riprap and stone along river edge?
Well, that's a good question. It's kind of a tough one. In the type of environment that we have downtown, which is basically already bulkheaded and seawalled, you're probably going to continue the same. Although in many instances, you may want to put riprap seaward of your seawall, particularly if your seawall is at a relatively low elevation. With the purpose of absorbing energy that the seawall normally reflects. It's kind of, you're not going to go downtown and convert it into a riprap shoreline. Some of the water depths in the center of the river under the bridges is 90 feet today. So it's a very deep environment, which has been constricted over, 50 to 100 years into a narrow waterway, which is now, stabilized by vertical bulkheads and seawalls. And so you're not going to be able to convert that.
I think Nancy Powell, do you have a question, Nancy?
I don't know what happened. Yeah, so with the bulkheads, are some, does there need to be, in your view, it seems to me that we need a kind of a comprehensive plan, because if you can't just raise bulkheads in certain areas, you have to raise them everywhere, right? If you need to raise the elevation, or in some cases, people are like they're adding fill on top to just raise up even right at the riverfront and then have the bulkhead. Is anybody thinking that way right now in the city or not?
No, it's very site specific. And, pragmatically, a lot of the bulkheading, let's say downtown, maybe in the shipyards area and in other areas, the existing bulkheads and seawalls are very old. And so in those type of instances where you have that large scale development, you're probably going to replace those walls anyways, because they have a limited life. And if you're developing something from in a multi-decadal fashion, you're going to want to replace those walls. So in those cases, there are instances where you probably can raise the elevation of the waterfront wall by some measure. Placing grade behind it and increasing grade obviously is something that can be done, particularly on the large scale projects, shipyards, museums, parks. You have that latitude where you can manipulate the upland to your advantage. When it comes down to the single family, owner, it becomes much more difficult, because you're right, the water will go around the wall. So when you're looking at the historical neighborhoods and the walls that exist there, it's a bit of a conundrum. Matter of fact, there's a proposal I read recently where St. Vincent's is going to be spending money on some kind of a wall, which I'm very interested to see what it is. And because as I showed, it's not just the interception of waves, which is a liability for the St. Vincent's waterfront and their walkway. It's literally the astronomical tides in the near future. So in that particular case, they may have to raise both the wall and the upland and their walkways. So I really haven't seen what the nature of that is, that proposal is, but I think they were talking about $10 million FEMA grant to do something there.
Are there any other questions? Does anyone have any questions for Erik? Ted?
Hogan's Creek starts from 11th Street. That's north of 8th Street in Springfield. And it collects a lot of drainage in Springfield all the way down to the river. What happens with this flooding with Hogan's Creek and all the development around it? How is that being addressed, or how could it be addressed?
Well, that is going to take study, and probably it's large enough to include a modeling to evaluate the ways that you can relieve the upland drainage in that location. But again, in doing it and looking at the stabilization of the shoreline on Hogan's Creek, particularly where you have nuisance flooding, you know, the designers are going to have to take into account the super elevation of the river at periods of time, and to evaluate just what the, you know, what magnitude of benefit they will get out of various improvements further up the creek. Particularly as they begin to develop it. It's actually also a two-edged sword. You know, you can improve the channelization of your creeks, and you can muck them out to alleviate a lot of the drainage that occurs and the impoundment of drainage. But you've also got to look at the other side of the sword, whereby you may be allowing storm surges to enter your area of interest also. And it may take some unique structures to address that type of an issue. You know, there are places around the world where we have structures across creeks and rivers, and well, the Dutch, for example, to attenuate storm surge that comes up a riverine or a tributary. And it may take some unique types of structures to be able to do the types of improvements that you want in the upland on Hogan's Creek and areas like that.
Would setbacks from the river require increased setbacks from the river, from the bulkhead back north? Would that help the situation later? I mean, as part of an overall approach to the problem?
Yes, you know, with high frequency flooding, setbacks probably has merit in that the level of impact would be reduced, and the water would have a better ability to dissipate and drain, etc. Setbacks are always a good thing, but it's a difficult thing to implement when the goal of the structure, or the goal of the development is to maximize the benefits of the waterfront. But you know, the conversion or the maximization of parks and large scale setbacks, I think, is probably an extremely prudent thing for the city of Jacksonville to be considering. And I certainly hope that it does become incorporated in the big picture in the downtown development scheme. Particularly in areas like the Landing. But, you know, a lot of it's a political decision.
Something so, I think a point you've made really well here, or at least gotten to, is that the city is slow. And you said it's a little bit behind the curve, but that doesn't preclude successful resiliency projects, right? Like, I was so taken by your FIS example, because it was an example of a really good collaboration. From my first thought was, oh, an A and E, architecture and engineering, working so well together. That's great. But then even beyond that, as you start to say that we can't wait for the city to pull us, what I'm hearing is you're saying it's the private owners that are pulling us. They're the ones that are implementing these for probably smart, self-interested reasons. And you know what's so interesting about that is we are the American Institute of Architects. We're architects. We have our clients' ear. We are so important in how they make these decisions. And if we're telling them that these are important considerations, this is money well spent, I mean, we have the time in front of these people. We have the chance to advocate for this. This is, we can't wait for the city. We can't wait for those minimum requirements. We're really the people that can create a lot of change through our clients directly. And maybe those clients are already on board, but maybe they need a little push and a little, you know, we help them make the argument for why it's smart from a financial perspective as well. So I really find how interesting it is, then how much impact we as a group could make individually, and how it could collectively impact the downtown.
No, you're exactly right. And the FIS building is a, you know, poster child of how to do it right. Obviously, it had a sophisticated design team, comprehensive design team, and the owner was extraordinarily flexible and understood that to protect their own interests, particularly over the long haul. You know, it's not a 30-year mortgage anymore that you're just considering, particularly if it's your building, it's your headquarters, and you're going to own this infrastructure. That it's extremely cost effective to begin to evaluate all factors. You know, just, you know, it used to be we didn't have sprinklers in buildings, and now that's commonplace. But if you're building on the waterfront, you know, you need to be able to understand the phenomena that are going to affect the longevity of your building and the potential impacts and maintenance of your building over time.
I think we do have a couple more questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Can naturalizing creeks like McCoy's and Hogan's make that, by making them wider, reduce flooding risk?
It can reduce flooding risk where you have the impedance of drainage due to the fact that the creek doesn't have the conveyance that it should have under rainfall events. And so for rainfall events, yes, I mean, you can improve creeks. I mean, just like putting in a bigger culvert to take away upland drainage during a rainfall event. So from that perspective, yes, and certainly a lot of these creeks, a lot of the flooding that we see during rainfall events does have to do with the fact that they're, well, just they haven't been maintained, or development has infringed upon them to the point that the drainage, the amount of runoff has increased substantially since they were first conceived. So in those instances, yeah, particularly for purposes of rainfall events.
Another question is, it's like rapid fire. So thanks for accepting our questions. Can dam or dike technologies like we see in Holland be utilized to protect the urban core?
Yes, particularly maybe on some of the creeks, like Hogan's Creek. You know, it could be that you have some type of a drainage structure which maximizes water flows out, but when you have an extreme event where you have the water level and the river becomes high enough, that you could have some type of a spillway or dam or something of that nature. Pragmatically, I think what's going to happen, however, in the future is that we're going to have to become more dependent upon pumping systems. And unfortunately, that's energy dependent. You know, we have the luxury of gravity drainage, which costs nothing. But I know that in the historical neighborhoods today, where just like I showed you, Riverside and Stockton, we need a pumping station at the end of Stockton Street in order to drain Riverside Avenue. That's a fact of life. So I think we're going to be more dependent in the future on a lot of mechanical systems. But there may be some limited instances where inflatable dams, for example, or things of that nature can be utilized. But it's very site specific.
I think maybe our last question is, does the landing property have the same risks as the FIS and shipyards properties?
Yes, it does. But it's all relative to the elevation of the landform. So let's say, but it's all the criteria is the same, okay? The base flood elevation should be increased to 7 feet. You need to look at high frequency flooding, things of that nature. But again, you know, I'm not sure what the absolute elevation of the landing is. So with respect to the phenomena, they're the same for everything downtown on the north and south bank. Whether you're the district or you're the shipyards or you're the FIS area, the fundamental parameters that you need to deal with for resiliency were pretty much earmarked in my discussion here. And they're described in great detail in the shipyards report, and a much better, I write better than I talk, let's put it that way. And that information is all available, can be made available.
Wow.
Andrea,
yeah.
can I ask something real quick? It was interesting, Eric. I think one thing too that is important is, you know, kind of getting back to the question I asked before, is this idea that we plan for resiliency on a site-by-site basis, and really need to think of the more holistic approach in the bigger picture, like you said, Eric, because a good example is I just attended a task force a technical task force meeting for the vulnerability assessment the city's currently is doing with CH2M Hill. And it was interesting because they've identified 64 vulnerable critical assets in the city by 2040. And one of those critical assets that was not identified was St. Vincent's. And I asked them, why is that the case? And they said, because the first floor elevation would not flood based on, you know, their models. But what my comments were is that, but it would be surrounded by water. So, you know, it makes that asset, while it may not flood, the asset itself is vulnerable because you can't access it, or you can't get patients in and out of the facility. And so I think that's something to take into consideration. It's not just about, we can't just raise up the water or the elevation of our buildings. We also have to look at how is the surrounding area affected as well, because we can't just create a bunch of islands. So
that's a good point. And I will tell you that when I was on the AAA workshop committee, we had people come talk with us, one of which was the JEA, who had done a facility analysis, a vulnerability analysis on their facilities. And when I got into it and I looked at the modeling that was used to determine the vulnerability of pumping stations, electrical stations, et cetera, the individuals who performed the modeling were very proud that they replicated the FEMA elevations. And, you know, the first thing that I realized is that, well, that's fine, but the FEMA elevations are wrong for downtown. And so, you know, you've done this analysis on the basis of all the +4 feet NAVD, for example, which may have been the same conclusion for St. Vincent's, I don't know. But, you know, there is this deference to the FEMA studies without fully understanding the shortcomings in the FEMA protocol that are used for their modeling and for their predictions. And it all falls apart for downtown Jacksonville and the historic neighborhoods. Now, it's good from there seaward, you know, the beaches and Mill Cove and those areas within the St. Johns River that are subject to the storm surge in the ocean. But the areas within the river from the city core southward are ill-served by anyone deferring to any of the FEMA criteria.
Yeah, Karen just put in the chat, great presentation and information. Thank you. I couldn't have said it better myself. This has been an awesome presentation. I know I learned a ton. I'm sure everyone learned